Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland and this week's Full Scottish. It's Sunday the 24th of August and my name is Brian Liddy. On the programme this week we're delighted to be joined by John Redpath. John is the SNP candidate for Ettrick, Roxburgh and Berwickshire in next year's Holyrood elections. So good afternoon, John. How are you?
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'm doing great. Thanks.
Thank you. And we're also delighted to be welcomed by our regular guest, the writer and activist William Duguid. Good afternoon, William. How are you?
Yes, I'm just fine. Thank you very much. Just finished my swatting.
Okay, for today's show, you mean, yeah?
Yeah, yeah.
Ruined your weekend already then. So to start with, we have the routine Middle East update. At least 62,686 Palestinians have been killed and 15,751 have been wounded in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023. 8 more people, including a child, have died in Gaza Strip. Forgive me, there was no comma in that there, so it was 157,000 over that. So 8 more people, including a child, have died in the Gaza Strip in the past 24 hours due to famine and severe malnutrition. According to hospital data, the death toll from starvation and malnutrition across the Gaza Strip has now reached 289. That includes 115 children. This week, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, UNICEF, the United Nations World Food Programme, the WFP and the World Health Organization reiterated their call for an immediate ceasefire and unhindered humanitarian access to curb deaths from hunger and malnutrition as they declared famine in Gaza for the first time. More than 500,000 people in Gaza are trapped in famine, marked by widespread starvation, destitution and preventable deaths, according to a new integrated food security phase classification. Analysis released on Friday showed that famine conditions are projected to spread from Gaza Governorate to Deir al-Balah and Khan Yunis Governorates in the coming weeks. World leaders responded by stamping their feet indignantly and then continued to sell arms to Israel. William, it seems that the situation just continues to get worse in Gaza. I was thinking about it on the way into the studio, about the famine that's been declared. And if I was there trapped in Gaza and I would be facing a choice, do I stay at home and starve and die due to dehydration, or do I risk going outdoors to one of the few bits of humanitarian aid that might be getting through and risk being shot by an Israeli sniper?
Well, those are constant risks. And of course, that would be fine. You would have that choice if you were an individual. But if you had a family to think about, you would be hindered even further in your choice. You would have to go out and try and get hold of the aid. And not only be under threat of being shot, but be castigated for your bad behaviour and lack of organisation as people all rush to get aid at the same time. Of course they do. They're starving. There absolutely needs to be unhindered aid, and there absolutely needs to be a ceasefire at this point, because things will continue to get worse if neither of those things happens. And so, I think our government and others need to keep calling for the ceasefire. But there is still some debate about their continuing, if you like, involvement and tacit support of Israel, which on its current behaviour should be a pariah nation at present. And I do hope that public opinion is matched at some point, because there's growing public opinion against this atrocity that's constantly going on, that governments catch up with public opinion and maybe take slightly stronger measures against Israel than they're currently doing. With the US still being a major influencer, I think that's an unlikely immediate prospect, but I do hope it happens sooner or later, because the people of Gaza cannot wait.
Thank you, William. And I think it's only fair that I should maybe repeat the figures that I botched earlier on. So at least 62,622 Palestinians have been killed and 157,673 people have been wounded in Gaza since the 7th of October this week. John, Those are, and apparently those are yesterday's figures, so apologies. So it's higher again today. So, John, the First Minister this week repeated his call for Westminster to be recalled due to the situation in Gaza and described it as a genocide. What's your thoughts?
So I very much agree with what the First Minister said. It is a genocide. It is absolutely heartbreaking seeing what's going on over there at the moment. Parliament should be recalled. There shouldn't be any conditions put on for finding Palestine as a state. We should have done that already by now, and we need to be able to get aid in. There needs to be pathways for people to get out of Gaza. But also we need to, public, as William says, public opinion's there. Just our politicians are too timid to do anything about it. And because the US and Donald Trump plays a big part in this, I think Keir Starmer's trying to still be his best pal rather than doing the right thing. But it is horrific. It is a genocide. It's about time that everyone accepted that and that Parliament was recalled so we could get a ceasefire in place now.
Thank you, John. So today's Ukraine update. Today is day 1000. You want us to stick on Gaza? Okay. William, is there anything more that you'd like to say about the situation in Gaza?
Well, I would like to know more of the genuine truth about the continuing supply and how much there is of arms and similar support to Israel, because there have lately been ministerial statements saying that there haven't been any actual exports of arms to Israel since April 2024. That's contradicted by other accounts, and I'd like to dig into those figures, or like not here and today, but I'd like the government to be forced to dig into these figures a little bit more, because certainly the latest figures we have is December 2024, when the government had approved 127 million worth of export licenses, which aren't the same thing as actual exports. There may be reasons, they're permissions basically, but the fact that the government was prepared to accept exports to Israel, whether or not they've happened directly or through third parties and simply haven't been reported, I'd like to know about that as well. The fact that they're prepared to contemplate that and still prepared to contemplate it, I think, tells me a lot about what the government is doing. It's playing two sides here. It's wanting to keep in with Israel and it's wanting to keep in with the US. And it's not good enough. We should not be in any way, shape, or form supplying anything to Israel at this point in terms of armaments, whether or not they're likely to get used in Gaza. And we should also, in terms of what's the biggest component, if you like, of potentially arms for Israel, is the components for the F-35 fighter jets that basically the UK supplies through Baker Martin. 15% of those. Now, they don't go directly to Israel. They go into a supply pool, which is run by a number of countries, including the UK, the US, some European countries, Canada, Turkey, etc. And Israel has access to those. I think those countries should ensure that Israel does not have access to those at this point. And that's the sort of strong reaction you need to be making as a government to what Israel is doing. Because if you allow this, what are you going to allow in future when it's somebody else who's been one of your pals who's doing it?
Thank you, William. So there's a report which confirmed that famine has been confirmed in Gaza for the first time, John, and it's actually given an official definition to famine. There are different phases through which famine can progress until the classification for famine means that the most extreme category is triggered when 3 critical thresholds, that's extreme food deprivation, acute malnutrition and starvation-related deaths, have been breached. So this is now getting to a stage where it's measurable in Gaza, and they say that a ceasefire is now an absolute and moral imperative now. What's your thoughts again?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some Israeli defence that we are apparently changing the criteria for famine, which is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, anyone that's seen the scenes coming from Gaza can see the absolute devastation that's happening there. As I say, I reiterate the fact that Parliament needs to be recalled now, a ceasefire needs to be reached, there needs to be a two-state solution, and Palestine needs to be recognised as a state, and there should be no terms attached to that. The only way we're going to get peace in the region is by a two-state solution. And unfortunately, it seems unlikely that we'll achieve that with Netanyahu still in post.
And John, do you think Keir Starmer will listen to John Swinney and recall Parliament?
Well, the UK government doesn't really have a habit of listening to us here up in Scotland, does it? So I think with public opinion being the way it is, I think the pressure will come to bear on our politicians down in Westminster. I mean, I don't know how you can sit there and be as complicit as the UK government is in this situation. I hope that it's recalled. If anything, if they don't, they're just continuing to be complicit in a genocide.
Thank you, John. So today's Ukraine update. Today is the 1278th day of the war in Ukraine. Pentagon has been blocking Ukraine from using US-made long-range missiles to strike targets inside Russia, limiting Kyiv's ability to employ the weapons in its defence, the Wall Street Journal has reported. As the White House has sought to persuade Putin to meet Zelensky for peace talks, an approval process put in place at the Pentagon has kept Ukraine from using the Army Tactical Missile System, or the ATACMS, to launch strikes deep into Russian territory. Russia says its forces have taken 2 villages in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk region, increasing the military pressure amid struggling international efforts to broker an end to the war. Moscow's forces captured the villages of Sredny and Klebanbek along the 1,000-kilometre or 620-mile front line in Donetsk. The taking of Klebanbek would mark a further advance towards Kostianivka, forgive my mispronunciation, a key fortified town on the road to Kramatorsk, which is the location of a major Ukrainian logistics base. Russian air defences claim to have downed a drone headed for Moscow on Saturday. Several airports in central Russia suspended operations because of concerns over airspace safety, and Russia's Air Transport Agency have said. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa had added his voice to calls for a Russian-Ukraine summit during a phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. President Ramaphosa stressed the urgency of holding bilateral and trilateral meetings between the leaders of Russia and Ukraine and the United States as key to signal a firm commitment to ending the war, a statement from Ramaphosa's office said on Saturday. France is reported to have summoned the Italian ambassador after Italian Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini challenged French President Emmanuel Macron for suggesting European soldiers be deployed in Ukraine in a post-war settlement. Asked during the week to comment on Macron's appeals to deploy European soldiers in Ukraine after such a deal with Russia, Salvini used a Milanese dialect phrase loosely translatable as "get lost. You go there if you want. Put your helmet on, your jacket, your rifle, and you go to Ukraine," he told reporters, referring to Macron. The family of an aid volunteer from the UK who was reported to have been killed in a drone strike in Ukraine have said they are very disappointed by the response from authorities. Annie Lewis Murphy, 69, travelled from her home in Silverton in Devon in May to deliver a vehicle packed with supplies in a mission arranged by the non-profit Aid Ukraine UK. She was fatally injured in a Russian drone strike on the 11th of June, according to a police file, while Kramatorsk Direct Police Department said her body remained in an area of hostilities and could not be evacuated. Lewis Murphy's relatives have asked for a death certificate to be issued for the mother of 3. All the family, the sisters and the sons, have been very disappointed at the reaction of the FCDO and the lack of response from the police, the relatives said, adding, the family are desperate to get more information. Today is Ukrainian Independence Day as the country marks 34 years since it left the Soviet Union. So, John, forgive my pause there. There was no mention of, that's quite a lengthy update today, there was no mention really of Trump, and I wonder if you're like me, I'm struggling to keep up with his attempts to get peace in the Ukraine. Have you got any news for us there?
Well, I think it's obvious that the stirrings of him wanting to win the Nobel for the Peace Prize is obvious. But I mean, any attempt to try and get peace in the region is welcome. But obviously, the devil's in the detail with it. Again, Russia is another state that we've sort of placated for long enough, and Putin just thinks he can get away with what he's doing. I mean, he expected Ukraine to fall in less than a week when he invaded, but it just goes to show the resolve of the people that they've not. And we need to make sure that we hold back his advances. And because if anyone thinks he's just going to stop at Ukraine, they're fooling themselves. He's got ambitions for the old Russian Empire and will continue to plough on. So we've got to defend Ukraine at all cost.
Thank you, John. And William, there was that awful story of Lewis Maffrey, who went to Ukraine to try and help with humanitarian aid and the like. And her family are going to be desperate for Trump to make inroads on any kind of peace plan, aren't they?
Well, I'm not sure about Trump's exact intentions and what he regards as a viable peace plan. I think we're just in a very dangerous time in the world now, because Putin has been allowed to get so far. And yes, I think he probably does have other ambitions. I do think, though, that thus far in Ukraine, Putin's ambitions have resulted in an awful lot of dead soldiers. And even, I think, if he were to continue to press the war in Ukraine, and Ukraine were forced into the position of having to repel that for another little while, it would take some considerable time for Putin even to get completely through the Donbass and take control of that. So I think Putin does have ambitions, and I think that we need to stand up to him. And we have to be very careful about how that goes, because we certainly don't want to get into World War III. We want to be looking strong enough and capable of defending the line that Putin doesn't think it's worth the candle to go any further, basically. Now, is that Trump's intention? I don't think it's Trump's intention at all. At this stage, it hardly really matters whether Trump is actually actively supporting Putin and just saying the odd thing about, oh, he's making me cross right now to make it look like he isn't, or if, more likely, Putin is just completely playing Trump like a fiddle, and Trump is his mind is full of what's last been said to him, which I've often thought has been the case with Trump. But the way things stand, that's almost certain of that.
Okay, thank you, John. So the cost of living crisis, the latest inflation figures at 3.8% as the cost of living crisis continues to bite. Cost of living crisis took hold after the invasion of Ukraine and was exacerbated by Brexit and then by Liz Truss. But after 1 year in office, Labour are struggling to promote growth in the UK economy, and now to shift capital investment away from borrowing, Labour are proposing a return to PFIs, but under a new name called PPPs, to build health centres in England. But the question is, at what cost? John, I think this one is... no, William, this one's for you. So Kate Forbes, the Deputy First Minister, said that the rise in inflation to 3.8% was more than expected and proves that the cost of living is doing businesses in Scotland remains high. But she said the Scottish Government are taking steps with the limited powers that they have, like abolishing peak rail fares. By the way, rail fares in England are expected to rise next year by 5.8%. Have you had a chance, William, to look at what these new PFIs are going to be? Are they going to be any better than the old ones?
Well, the devil is always going to be in the detail. I always am very suspicious of rebrandings. It's kind of like the Windscale Sellafield effect. So the PPPs, or whatever they are, if they involve basically borrowing in the same way as PFIs were for many, many years, then you've got the initial pros of spreading the cost over time, and the huge capital outlay at one go is effectively put down through 30 years or something like that. That's fine, but it's basically like a very expensive credit card. PFI financing costs in the past have typically been 3 to 4 percentage points higher than government debt. So if your gilts are, for example, at 4%, your PFI borrowing is going to be 8% or 9%. And that makes a difference when you're doing repayments over that long sort of period. The Labour Research Department, which is a trade union body that sort of advises trade unions about things, estimated that the capital assets under PFI to date are at 60 billion, but they've cost over the contract lifetime 306 billion. And in Scotland, Audit Scotland estimated that there's been £5.7 billion of infrastructure delivered via PFI, and we've got commitments for payment through to 2047-48 of 40.1 billion. And for Scotland, that matters because we do have a limited budget. At least the UK government can print money. So I don't have any faith in any new scheme or any new wheeze that involves kicking the can down the road as far as payment goes. Do it properly. And you know, I don't want to be an outspoken advocate of modern monetary theory, but there are things the government can do in terms of borrowing to make it work a wee bit better and do it at a rate that's sustainable. And I think they should be looking at that. But that would involve Rachel Reeves looking at her fiscal rules in perhaps a different way from the way she's been looking thus far.
Thank you, William. John, as an SNP candidate, what are your thoughts about what Kate Forbes said about inflation going up to 3.8% in Scotland's limited powers? Peak rail fares being abolished here in Scotland, while rail fares are about to go up in England next year.
Yeah, and also we're about to celebrate the anniversary of the Borders Railway, which was obviously delivered by this SNP government, which was opposed by the Tories down the road previously. But people are really struggling right now. You know, it's a cliche to say that, you know, people are scarred with it. Their wages aren't keeping up with the prices. Labour are just going to labour, you know, bringing back PFI under a new guise. We've seen the trouble that the Parliament's been in with dedicating so much of its revenue to pay off this stuff. But Rachel Reeves has blocked herself into this with the fiscal rules she picked. You know, if she could have been more sensible about it and been more honest with the public about the mess that they claim was left for them, and to be fair, yes, it was a mess, especially after Liz Truss, they could have had more flexibility with it. I mean, I know, you know, it's slightly different here, but in America, they've sometimes had stimulus packages to go into it to kickstart growth and build stuff. So I don't understand why we're bothering with making it look great that we're building hospitals now, but paying for it 40, 50 years down the line. And obviously with Scotland having a limited budget, it just hammers away at what we're able to do. I mean, I personally do think we're coming to the limits of what we're able to do in devolution in terms of mitigating bad policy by people that just don't have a clue.
Thank you, John. William, so fuel and airfares apparently were two of the main culprits that pushed up the interest rates this year. Food and non-alcoholic beverages were up 4.9% year on year in July. That's an increase from 4.5% in the 12 months to June. Beef and orange juice, coffee and chocolate were also among the worst hit products. And then Sharon Graham, the head of the Unite, the second largest union, said that the government needs to ease the pressure on household budgets after these increases in food costs. Said that workers and their families are struggling to pay excessive bills. Pressure needs to be taken off family budgets by giving workers a pay rise. That would be quite a good solution, wouldn't it? Because then it would give people money to spend in the shops, and that would then help the economy as well, no?
That's arguably true, but at the same time, then you get into a pay inflation spiral, possibly, and that can be just as difficult to then get the inflation down. And I would be more interested in something that looked at the current costs a household face, and I think that perhaps energy costs are primarily among those. We know all the debates about how energy could be much cheaper in Scotland if we just did it right. But there is a case for entirely revamping the energy market to make the cost of energy to the consumer reflective of the way in which the various sources of energy are produced, rather than against the most expensive method, which is currently just edging out nuclear, I think, oil and gas. And if we were radical about our approach to the energy market, and we do spend more on energy, it costs more here in the UK, and in particular Scotland, than in most of Europe. So it's not impossible, but we need to stop kowtowing to the energy companies and actually do some serious reform that would benefit families in the short term, and yes, then give them more money that they can spend on other things, and that's just fine. So let's not feed the beast as it currently exists. Let's change things, would be my view.
Thank you, William. John, William mentioned in response to Sharon Graham's call for the government to pay workers more, and William said, "Oh, but then you've got a pay spiral." So there are going to be pay rises negotiations coming up, especially in the public sector, the NHS. In England, resident doctors recently asked for a huge pay rise, but not yet here in Scotland. But what do you think? John, I don't know if you heard, if you can hear me there. I think it was implied that we don't have the same problem here in Scotland. I said it was in England that resident doctors have asked for a massive pay rise, but not in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, we have a different sort of attitude and relationship with trade unions and workers here in Scotland, especially in the health service. I mean, that's why we avoided strike action in our NHS during the pay disputes. I mean, I agree with William there that you need to have a more holistic approach to it and look at the wider economy as a whole. You can't just try and outpace costs with just throwing money at wages, because then you get into the inflation from wages issue to deal with. But you can do both. Find ways of cutting costs for people, and energy is the biggest one. In fact, I'm surprised we're not more angry than we already are about that. We have all the energy but none of the power here in Scotland. We produce far more than we need, but yet we pay the highest prices. So there definitely needs to be a radical approach to how we handle energy. And when you start bringing down costs, making it more easy for people, then you can start dealing with pay and income inequality and sort of start to build that up so people have got a more substantial standard of living.
Thank you, John. And these new PPPs that the Starmer Labour government is starting to talk about, do you think that Westminster might impose these on Scotland? In Scotland, we've got a different system up here. We replaced PFIs, didn't we? John.
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, it could all change, if we don't win the election next year. Now, I'm feeling hopeful about where we are. We're certainly a lot better position than we were in 2024, but, there's still all to play for. And, there's a lot of things that we have in Scotland that folk just think, oh, they're always going to be there. But I can tell you one thing, if there's a change of government up here, there's a lot of the stuff that we have might end up going. So things might get a bit tougher. But, it's not news to us that Westminster might impose policies up here in Scotland. They've got a bit of form on doing that. And unfortunately, because of the way the Scotland Act's structured and the Internal Market Act, we're kind of left at the whims of a Westminster government, whatever colour they are, although they're all starting to merge into one.
Thank you, John. And William, I was reading an article in The Guardian today that said that the rise in inflation is also exacerbated by droughts in countries like Spain, Italy and Portugal, places where the UK sources much of its fresh fruit and veg, have pushed up prices this summer. And then, of course, Rachel Reeves increased the employers' national insurance contributions, which hasn't helped. But the article didn't mention Brexit. Am I right to bring it up here?
Well, Brexit continues to spread its tentacles through the next lengthy period until something is done to reassert proper trade relationships with the EU on a similar basis to what we had before. But I think probably it's not a prime driver of what's happening. I mean, you actually just stated at the start what the main drivers of the rise in costs has been lately, and that includes transport, and it certainly, yes, includes the effect of Southern European droughts on the chocolate and coffee and fruit juice, etc. So we now live in a world where bad things are likely to happen, and they have shock effects. So you deal with what you can deal with to try and make things better, and that's what I'm asking for. And hopefully, at some point, you get round to doing something about the bad things. Although I suspect that with climate change, we may have missed that particular bus.
Okay, and would you maybe just like to finish up by something that John said, William, your thoughts about people voting next year, and if they don't vote for pro-independence parties, what's at risk?
I think there's a very good chance that we will have a unionist majority, perhaps slim. I think that will be mainly built on the list. I think the SNP will still at the current polling levels, and given the new multiplicity of unionist parties, may still take the lion's share of the constituency seats. But it's not a comfortable situation for the SNP for sure. And for the independence movement as a whole, I'm really not sure how even pro-independence voters are going to vote in many cases. And I'm thinking here about the large divide between recorded support for the SNP right now and recorded support for independence. And I do think there's a really significant chance that pro-independence voters will just stay at home. And I really would hate to see that, because I think for the independence movement, you could argue that it might be the kick in the tail we need if we have a unionist majority in Holyrood. I don't think so. I think it would be catastrophic, and I think we should resist it as much as we possibly can. And I'd like to hear a lot more from the independence parties about how the 2026 election will, at some level, be a vote for independence. And I'd also like there to be candidates that people are comfortable voting for on the pro-independence side, and I don't think we're there yet. The SNP conference next month, not next month, it's in October, it's nearly next month, will provide some pointers along that line, but we need to get a lot further down that line than we currently are.
Thank you, William. Labour MSP Colin Smith was arrested and charged in connection with possession of indecent images on Tuesday, and there was no call or no use of any blue tents when the police raided his property on the 5th of August in their investigations. And also this week, Jeremy Balfour MSP resigned from the Tories, saying the party has fallen into the trap of reactionary politics under Russell Finlay's leadership. So we should take these one by one. John, Colin Smith, first of all. Okay, he's been suspended from the Labour Party, but he's still an MSP. He'll now be standing as an independent. But should the system in Holyrood be changed if he does get charged? If he is found guilty, forgive me.
So obviously,
I've jumped the gun, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to comment too much on the live police investigation, but I'm sure Colin's having a bit of fresh air and that he's not had a blue tent in his garden. Obviously, we maintain in this country that you're innocent until proven otherwise. Obviously, it's been charged. I think we do need to have a certain level of public standards and decency in politics. I think if he's been charged, and maybe have to look at the fact of maybe taking a step back. But as I say, he's innocent until proven guilty, and he's entitled to that right until the courts play out their system.
Thank you, John. And William, this idea about, as a secondary question, isn't there? BBC Scotland in particular seems to be running a bit shy of the news. Is that a fair characterisation of the BBC?
So that they're running shy of the news.
Yeah, about Colin Smith.
Well, I watched a reporting. Yes, I watched it. Sorry, I watched a Reporting Scotland bulletin where they mentioned his arrest, and they mentioned that he was a Labour MSP, and on that level, all I'm asking for is equal treatment, and to me that's been provided in this case. There has been suspicion in the past that when it's an SNP person gets into some sort of trouble, the party is always mentioned. This particularly happens with councillors, and when it's a Labour or other councillor not attached to the SNP, there is no such mention. But not in this case. I think the BBC has gone as far as it can, and I totally agree with John that we can't really comment, because at this stage it's an ongoing police investigation. There may well turn out to be nothing to it, but Labour has taken the right step in suspending him, and they did so as quickly as they reasonably could. This happens across the party, so I'm not really sort of wanting to point out Labour in any way. They had a particularly unfortunate situation with this, where his arrest took place on the 5th of August, and then they released a video on, I think, 2 days later, where he appeared with Anas Sarwar, and then they subsequently, last weekend, found out that he'd been arrested, whereupon they had to pull the video. And I'm afraid that's just bad luck in that case. They have done the right thing, and he is within his rights to stay on as an independent MSP. He might want to consider whether he actually wants to stand in the next election if the thing drags on. But until he is, at the very least, charged, but I would suggest to you, found guilty, he's not under any great obligation to resign. And that's right, because we shouldn't just, leap to immediate conclusions and say he's out now because he's been arrested. Justice must take its course.
Thank you, William. And then also in this week, the Scottish Tory Party lost its second MSP this year. In April, MSP Jamie Green quit the Tories and joined the Lib Dems for what he accused the Tories of having a reform-light agenda. And then this week, Jeremy Balfour hasn't followed to the Lib Dems, but he's left the Scottish Tory Party and he's probably going to stand as an independent MSP. In his resignation letter, he accused the party of having fallen into the trap of reactionary politics and accused it of chasing cheap headlines. But it strikes me that that's not really a new thing, is it, John? I think I'm right in saying that Balfour, let me see, what was it that Patrick Harvey said about him, that he's voted for every reactionary proposal put forward by the Tories and against anything that was progressive in Hollywood, and yet now he's saying that they've gone too far right.
My simple thing is, where have you been, Jeremy? The Tories have been reactionary since I can remember, and at the tail end of the Ruth Davidson, they started being more and more reactionary, trying to get cheap headlines. It was turbocharged under Douglas Ross, and under the leadership of Russell Finlay and Rachel Hamilton as his deputy, they've just they've tried to become more reform than reform. So I think it might have more to do with the fact that he'd probably lose his seat as a Tory MSP rather than a come to Jesus moment where he suddenly cares about all the devastating cuts that they're trying to make in society.
Thank you, John. And William, underlying all of this, isn't there a risk that voters in 2026, we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but I'll ask it specifically, isn't there a risk that voters in 2026 in Holyrood are going to stay away, going to stay at home, and they're not going to vote because they'll think, well, there's the SNP, the £600,000, Peter Murrell, the Blue Tents, Colin Smith, Jeremy Balfour, all politicians, no matter what party they are, they're all the same. There's no point in voting for any of them.
That's a very big danger. I would hate to see a low turnout at Holyrood 2026 because I think right now defending Holyrood as a bastion of democracy is important, and that requires voters to be involved. I think there's a lot more should happen with Holyrood, but that involves perhaps becoming independent at some point. But we were very, very engaged with democracy in 2014, and we got many plaudits for it. And it's just subsequently gone into reverse. And I can see the appeal of the Plague on All Your Houses party. We hold at the hub, we hold stalls on a regular basis. We've been doing so through the summer, usually the first Saturday or thereabouts. And more than one person has come to us saying they're all the same. Often they draw the conclusion that as a result of them being all the same, they should then go out and vote reform rather than stay at home, which doesn't make any sense to me at all, because if there were ever an example of them all being the same, it's the backed by billionaires and millionaires Reform Party. But there you go. Disillusionment amongst voters isn't just confined to Scotland, but it's particularly pernicious in Scotland right now because its potential effects with regard to the future of the country over the next 10 to 20 years could be quite devastating. So I do hope that the political parties can come up with an offering and a presentation that makes it look like they're looking forward and that they have the interests of Scotland as a whole rather than their own party at heart. And I think the SNP are beginning to go down that road. I don't know how far they will get. I suspect that Jeremy Balfour's departure from the Tory party is an indication mostly of lack of direction, because I think, yes, he has been fairly reactionary through the years, that's for sure. But hey, that's the party label he's had up till now. But they really all need to be looking forward, and they all seem to be floundering at the moment. So not a healthy situation.
Thank you, William. And John, we're pretty much out of time on this, but as you're a candidate next year, it only feels fair to give you the last word on this item.
Yeah, so all of us who are described to the progressive side of politics need to get a message out of hope and optimism for the future. It's not just good enough to talk about, what's happening in the road. We need to sort of re-establish ourselves, sense of pride in what we're offering, and that's what I hope our party manifesto for the SNP will put forward to the election next year. And I look forward to standing under that banner.
Thank you, John. So, with reports that members of far-right parties are organising asylum hotel protests across the UK, the main UK parties and the media continue to report the demonstrations as being by local concerned citizens. In Perth yesterday, there was an anti-fascist group turned out to outnumber a small group of anti-immigrant demonstrators waving union flags. In the latest example, William, that's your neck of the woods, isn't it? So is this
Surprise.
is this your fault? And when I say that, I mean the anti-fascist protest, not the anti-asylum demo.
Well, first of all, I need to proffer my apologies because I actually had a prior engagement arranged several weeks ago in Edinburgh. So I was in Edinburgh yesterday, not in Perth, but I was taking careful note of what was going on there. The group, a fairly strong group that's against fascism in Perth and against racism, more to the point, is actually called Perth Against Racism and has a long history of standing up to anti-immigrant protests of one sort or another. So yesterday was a case in point when they did outnumber the opposing demonstration. But there was a previous occasion just 2 weeks ago when they had to do the same thing in the same place. That wasn't quite such a nationally organised one. Yesterday's appeared to be one that was breaking out all over the UK, basically, and Perth being one of the manifestations to it. Perth Against Racism, by the way, goes back to September 2017, when 1,500 of us showed up in Perth to see off 50 members of the Scottish Defence League. This was September 2017, who had just shown up to basically shout a lot. And it was a very, very impressive turnout. Yesterday's event, which was flagged only just in advance, didn't have the same turnout, but I hope we see greater turnouts if this kind of thing goes on, because I do think that we really need to get away from the idea that asylum seekers are a problem and not merely people who have come a long way to try and get away from persecution. We should be welcoming such people with open arms, and we should be putting together a system that allows us to support them adequately. And the big problem that we've got is that we don't currently have such a system. I think the way Britain runs its asylum system is hopeless. And that is part of the problem, because that provides the grounds on which the far right folks can blossom. Really, blossom is the wrong word. It just gives them license to protest with what's basically a bunch of falsehoods, and it's not pleasant, and it needs to be stood up to, and it needs to be stood up to in a non-violent way. And it was a bit confrontational yesterday, I understand, but I also understand that there were no arrests, and that's a good thing, because that's what standing up to badness is all about. It's about doing it in a firm, assertive way without resort to violence. And basically, they're cowards and they go away. And that should continue.
Thank you, William. John, we haven't seen anything like this yet in Glasgow. Susan Aitken, leader of Glasgow City Council, said that she's proud of the way Glasgow's given a home or a refuge to refugees. But she says that the city risks being overwhelmed by UK asylum policies. I mean, for example, asylum seekers and refugees are not allowed to work, which means they can't contribute to society. Do you agree with Susan Aitken?
Yes, I do. Some of the sort of biggest points that have been made to me from the sort of anti-asylum and immigration folk are like, well, they come over here and they can't, they're taking up the space and they can't work. It's like, well, our laws mean they can't work, and they get a pittance to live on each day. And that's why the Scottish Government obviously introduced the free bus passes for asylum seekers to help them get to their appointments and things like that, because they get a pittance to live on, and they're fleeing persecution. They're vulnerable people. They're not economic migrants, as people like to paint them all as. But my sort of philosophy has always been, I don't care what colour or creed you are. You're one of us, basically. We're all human at the end of the day. We've all got to be a bit kinder to each other and look after each other. Now, I know in today's society it's getting a bit more difficult. People are getting more frustrated. Things are not working out for them properly. But this is the old sort of divide and rule philosophy. This is what Farage feeds on. This is how he's probably likely to be the next Prime Minister. He divides the people that should actually be united against the people that are causing these hardships, not people fleeing persecution.
Thank you, John. William, I don't know, the national newspaper here in Scotland is planning a series where they're going to highlight positive stories of refugees in Scotland. They say they want to showcase how refugees and asylum seekers across Scotland have brought positive impacts to their communities. They want to profile people helping them to settle into their new homes. They want to show how those with refugee backgrounds are making a difference to public life in Scotland, and they want to challenge the misinformation and right-wing rhetoric dominating the conversation around refugees and asylum seekers. You said that we need to get tough on the far right, but do you think could this be a parallel tool that we could use?
I think telling the good stories is a good thing. Asylum seekers are very limited in what they can actually do, although I suspect they can volunteer for things, and that would be one way. Once you're a refugee, which basically means you've had your claim for asylum accepted, then that changes things, because at that point, you can go out and get work. And yes, you do have access to benefits, but you have the same access to benefits as everybody else. Yes, there are, I'm sure, a lot of cases of refugees who've gone on to do great things. And I'm thinking way back to the Glasgow Girls and things like that. So for the National to highlight that is good. However, if it doesn't get out beyond the National, that's not going to, National will have its readership, but not as many people as it might. So it's up to the rest of us also to be telling those stories, and to be telling those stories as part of the narrative that this is the way to operate. People come for asylum. We need to decide their claims fast, and we're not currently doing that. It takes up to a year. We're obliged to give them accommodation. We're obliged to do so under the 1951 Refugee Convention, to which we were a founding signatory. Hotels may or may not be the best way of doing it. The Labour government is going to try and bring that down. But the key thing is, it shouldn't take a long time to decide a claim. Therefore, your period in a hotel should be a short one. And if your claim is not met, then it's perfectly right for you to leave the country. But if your claim is met, then we should be doing everything we can to support refugees. And there are some things that Scotland does to help refugees integrate, and that includes bus passes. And when you say, why should they get bus passes? They get bus passes because they need to get to appointments, because they need to find work now that they're able to do so. So, yeah, tell the good stories, and let's change the nature of the debate, because it's a very, very limited debate at the moment, and it's founded almost entirely in racism and lies. Let's tell some truths.
Thank you, William. And John, you probably heard that Lucy Connolly, she was released early this week from prison, and it seems that she's become a figurehead for women and concerned mothers and grandmothers who protest outside so-called migrant hotels. Farage said of her, "You're now a symbol of Keir Starmer's authoritarian, broken two-tier Britain." How do you think that applies?
Where to even start on that one? I mean, I've seen that she said she was a political prisoner of Keir Starmer. I was like, no, you do stuff that's insightful or breaking the law, then yes, you should be held to the account. But this is what your far right does. It finds a figurehead and claims that they're being, misjudged or penalised unfairly, and everyone else is getting away with it. No, we're actually doing what they're asking us to do, and that's apply the law equally to everybody. So I'm not going to waste too much time on worrying about what she's got to say. She committed a criminal act, she went to prison, and that should be the end of it.
Thank you, John. And William, I don't know if you've seen the comments that where commentators are saying that these concerned women, mothers and grandmothers, because they are simply concerned, then they can't be racist. Would you agree with that?
No. In a word, I think what we're seeing is racism dressed up as concern. And it may be that they truly believe they're concerned, but they're concerned because they're being fed the lies by somebody else. And they're being led to believe that the people the relatives that they're worried about, the children perhaps that they're worried about, are under more threat than they actually are. And I repeat, if we dealt with asylum seekers quickly and effectively and decided their claims fairly, they would not be spending long times in hotels with almost no money, which leaves them open to perhaps criminals coming along and getting them into and all sorts of things that may stem from that. We need to fix the basic problem and everything else will follow from that.
Thank you, William. And so, why does the UK media give so much prominence to the far right? We'd like to ask. So, if I frame this by thinking about Keir Starmer, most commentators seem to agree that under Keir Starmer, Labour almost dumped its traditional Labour values right from the very start. And I've heard people say that it's because Starmer feels that he's got to go after Farage. The Overton window has shifted to the right, and Starmer's chasing after it. So, John, my question to you is Starmer compelled to move the Overton window to the right because of Farage, or because the media gives Farage a higher profile and a greater general prominence? Who's to blame here? Is it the media, or is it just simply politicians like Farage?
I think everyone's got a bit of blame in this, to be brutally honest. Keir Starmer's obviously misread it. You don't beat fascists by imitating them, you beat fascists by offering hope and a positive vision. Now, the problem with Keir Starmer, he's a technocrat, he's not a proper politician, so any sort of principle of value he has gets chucked on the fire if he thinks it can get him a couple more clicks. But I think what we're seeing in our media is what's happened in American media for a long time. They want the hits and they want the rates, and they know Farage will get viewership, because he's that polarizing that he's got a good fan base and there's a lot of people that loathe him. So they know they're going to get good clicks and good views and boost their media if they include him. I think what we need to do to combat it is having more platforms like this one and actually promote it a lot better. And that's down to me as a candidate and other pro-independence candidates as well. But offer an actual hope and take on the lies that Farage comes out with, rather than trying to placate him and trying to copy him, because you'll never out Farage. We should have learned that by now.
Thank you, John. And William, I suppose the best example of the media and the far right is the frequency with which Farage appears on BBC Question Time. So that's like a subtle melange of the two, the actual politician and the media. Where does the blame lie?
I think there's been a group in the media generally, I'm thinking mostly the print media and the paper magnates, that's been pushing the right-wing agenda and quite happy to embrace the far-right agenda, because it's the sort of material where you can get people kind of addicted on it and it helps sell you more copies. And I think they've been pushing that for a while. And on the back of that, because he featured in the papers, the BBC picked Farage up and, of course, had him on a good 30 times before he was ever elected to anything. And I think it's basically based on self-interest in the quarters of the media that are such supporters of the far right, and it's perhaps getting slightly out of control now. And yes, we need to build a strong media that's not that. Now, there are several examples of strong media that are not that are beginning to emerge. One is Byline Times. Within Scotland, we need to look very carefully about what we can do to put a different point of view. And of course, I would want it to be a pro-indie point of view, because I think we begin to be able to deal properly with many of these things if we become independent. The question is, how do we do that and how do we fund it? Right now, we have a lot of different silos within the pro-independence media, all of them struggling. And on that score, I'll do your usual appeal for you. And please do support the likes of Broadcasting Scotland folks, because it'll enable them to do so much more. But more than that, I would really like to see the pro-independence media built up and maybe cooperate a lot more, and maybe have a kind of funding pool from which they could all draw, and perhaps they could share resources more. And then there's different parts of it, Broadcasting Scotland and Independence Live and the Scotland channel and the various major podcasts. You could actually get yourself a recipe right now that could go through the day. Wouldn't stop them necessarily doing their own things. If they had a common platform and common funding, you could work out a way in which they could do their own thing, but also feature on something that people could watch. That might involve somebody getting hold of a broadcasting license, and there are people working on that. But the big question, the huge question, is how you fund it adequately. You can do it partially with a central pool, but we actually need people with big money to see this as something that's of interest to them. We hear an awful lot about independent supporters that are just waiting to lavish, rich ones who are wishing to lavish huge sums on the independence movement. At the meeting I was at yesterday, I heard another example. We've got people waiting in the wings. Those people have been waiting in the wings since 2014, and they've watched the independence movement go into the sand in many cases, and we haven't seen a penny. So I'm dubious about it. But if it were to be possible, I would like it to happen, because without proper funding, nothing happens.
Thank you, William, for the name check. It's true, it's a question we ask often on here, is how can we properly fund an independent Scottish broadcaster such as Broadcasting Scotland? But for these wealthy individuals, did you get their phone numbers? Because we can call them up and ask them to stump up.
Well, if I knew how to hack into their bank accounts, I would be doing that, wouldn't I? No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't dare suggest such a thing on a channel that's estimable as this.
Okay, we'll go 50-50 with anything that you get. John, the First Minister, John Swinney, how is he suggesting that the SNP should tackle the far right and the media, so the way that the SNPs often seem to be undermined by the media at the expense of the far right? What does Swinney suggest before the election next year?
Well, I mean, we've got a sort of sight of it where, and I mentioned it before, we need to offer real tangible hope to people to tackle the far right and get away from the mindset where it's easy just to blame someone else that's, maybe on the same level as you, another working class person, it's all their fault. I don't care what colour you are. If you're working class, you're working class. You're all part of the movement, But I think what we all need to do, and candidates, we're going to have to do this as well, is we're going to have to learn to become a bit of our own broadcasters and focus a lot more on getting into media, promoting our own media, be that through targeted ads on Facebook and things like that, because that's where the far right are doing the best right now. Now, obviously, they've got the more mainstream media feeding into their narrative as well. But I agree with everything, actually, that William said there about, I think we need to bring the movement together in many ways, back to the grassroots. We need to bring back together, but also in the media and about how we're broadcasting. We need to all be interlinked and joined in, because we're up against the British state. They've got unlimited amount of money, and if we're all fragmented, it's easy enough to pick us off. But if we start to unite, have a central pooling of funds, all work together and have a joint message across the platforms, I think we'll do a better job in tackling the far right.
Thank you, John. So finally, we just want to congratulate the Citizens Theatre in Glasgow, which reopened yesterday after a 7-year refurbishment, which was delayed by COVID and was hit by the cost of living crisis and due to cost of materials by Brexit. It looks like the cost could be as much as double the original £20 million estimate. But I did go to have a look at the new Citizens yesterday, and I would thoroughly recommend it. It looks incredible. But that's it for this week's Full Scottish. But before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. We can only exist with your support. Our programmes will, always be free to view. However, if you can afford just £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, or please simply donate whatever you can afford. So thank you again to our guests, to John Redpath and to William Duguid. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
And we'll let you get back to the rest of what's left of the weekend, and thank you and goodbye to you at home. Thank you for watching.